22 years ago, I was 11 years old. Growing up, I was always taught to respect adults, especially when in someone else's home. I was the youngest of 3. My dad traveled pretty frequently on business, and my mom was usually busy working or driving the 2 older siblings to whatever obligations they had going on. This meant that I spent a lot of time in other people's homes. I was always very friendly, polite. I enjoyed speaking to adults, actually. I was also an extremely nervous kid and tried my best to hide it. My mom was very emotionally abusive to me, and I believed her when she blamed my being a horrible child on her own abusive actions. Therefore, I was constantly in fear that someone would find out just how truly awful I really was. My approach to life at just 11 years old was, be polite, never make waves, and don't piss off Mom. It was the week of 4th of July, and a girl I went to school with, Leia, invited me and another girl, Carla, over to swim in her pool and spend the night. At this point, I'd known both girls for about 5 or 6 years, but we had only recently become better friends. My mom dropped me off and gave me the usual, have fun, don't embarrass me speech. I actually remember having so much fun the entire day. I was young for my grade, so while I was still 11, Leia and Carla were both 12. They flirted with boys and even wore bras. I was a tomboy and as flat as the floor, so Leia and Carla were really cool to me. We had the best time together. At night we did girly things like talk about boys and play with makeup. It was so different from my normal summer night hangouts playing capture the flag with the neighborhood boys. The next morning, we were still giggling and having lots of fun together. Leia asked her mom if Carla and I could spend the night over again. She said yes, and me and Carla jumped around with excitement. It was the 4th of July, and Leia's dad was coming back from wherever he had been the night before, with fireworks. A bit later, Leia's dad, LD, pulled into the driveway. Now, I had never met Leia's dad before. He stepped out of the car wearing cut-off jean shorts and no shirt, smoking a cigarette. His hair was very straggly and greasy. Leia called out, "Hey, Dad." "Who's this?" he replied, looking at me. I introduced myself and he walked inside. Leia's mom told us to pick things up around the house because they were having some people over that night. We did as she asked. I remember almost immediately noticing a shift in the overall vibe in the house, though. It was something I was quite familiar with, as my mom could change the feeling in our house from warm and happy to cold and spiteful in the blink of an eye. Typically, there was some sort of yelling that accompanied that shift in my house, though. It was different at Leia's. It was so cold, but everyone appeared to be going on as usual. A couple of hours later, we went outside with LD. He had this enormous slingshot thing he had made in the garage. He asked me if I wanted to see what it did. Sure. He put a potato in it and launched the thing into a field across the street. He asked if I wanted to try it too. Really? Yeah. I would never be allowed to do this sort of thing at home, so of course I took him up on it. Leia and Carla wanted to try it too. He gave a quick sure and walked away to go grab another beer. Once they were finished, he asked if I'd like him to show me some cool tricks he could do with the slingshot. He addressed me directly by name. He did not ask Leia or Carla. This felt weird, but I smiled and wanted to keep being polite, since he was an adult and I was a guest in his home after all. Eventually, friends of Leia's parents started to trickle in here and there. Leia, Carla, and I went back and forth between playing in the pool and playing in the garage. Every time we'd go back to the garage, LD would ask me lots of questions and comment on how cool I was. He would ask me if I had a boyfriend yet, if I too had started wearing a bra like Leia. Leia just kinda laughed and said something like, "Stop talking about that stuff, jeez." I smiled and tried to hide how uncomfortable it made me feel. A few minutes later, a man arrived with his daughter. This guy was LD's best friend. Leia's dad began calling my name and motioning me to come over. "Hey, this is Leia's friend. She's really cool and she loves our slingshot." The two of them built it together. "Oh yeah? Hi, Leia's friend." "Oh, nice to meet you." As the night continued, it felt like every time Leia, Carla, and I were near LD and Dude, for the future reference, they had something to ask or tell me. The other two didn't seem to think this was weird or even notice, really. It was now dark, the fireworks were all done, and I was getting really tired of having to engage with conversation with LD and Dude. They smelled like cigarettes, and they'd put their arms around my shoulders a couple of times. I didn't like them touching me, but I never said anything. I just acted like everything was fine and tried to laugh it off. I suggested we go back to Leia's room to play this game we had played a few times over the last couple of days. Finally, we were away from them. Then LD and Dude came into Leia's room and said we should come outside to the bonfire for some s'mores. They also had another brilliant idea for us. We should sleep in the camper tonight. Leia's family had this camper at the very end of the backyard, right next to the bonfire. Leia and Carla both loved this idea, but it just made me sick. Still, I didn't want to spoil any fun, and I didn't want to offend LD or Dude. They were both adults, and this was LD's house, so I kinda had to be nice. All I wanted to do was run away from both of them, though. We were walking out to the backyard carrying blankets and pillows. Dude walked up to us and said his daughter wanted to join us in the camper tonight. His daughter was only a year or so younger than me, about 10, but she was much smaller and acted so much younger. She was very timid and quiet, and when she did speak, it was almost babyish. LD and Dude were getting more drunk by the minute. After we finished getting set up in the camper, DD, the Dude's daughter, asked me to take her back to the house to go to the bathroom. I had just met DD a few hours before, but she seemed to sort of cling to me immediately. When we were walking back to the house, around a half football field from the camper, she suddenly grabbed my hand while we were walking. She asked if she could sleep next to me in the camper. "Sure," I said. On the way back from the bathroom, DD took my hand again and held it tightly the entire way back as she sucked her thumb. She clung to me and asked me once again if I was really going to sleep next to her. This made me even more nervous. I just wanted to run away. We all got situated in the camper, and Leia, Carla, and DD were asleep pretty quickly. LD and Dude were soon joined by another guy whose voice I didn't recognize. All three were right outside the camper, sitting by the bonfire. They were drunk and extremely loud. I could tell something was so wrong about the situation. My heart was racing, and I was praying to God to help me make it through the night. Suddenly, though, they were quiet. I felt the camper moving. The door opened. He whispered into the camper, "Leia's friend, Leia's friend." My back was turned towards him, and I pretended to be asleep. I didn't move, I didn't answer, I just waited. After a few minutes, he went back outside. I heard him say, "She's asleep." Dude told him, "Just wake her up. Tell her we have something to show her or something." A few minutes later, LD returned and again started whispering my name. He went back outside and told them I wasn't waking up. The third guy told him to just shake me awake. Thankfully, I positioned myself furthest from the door on an upper bunk with DD next to me. Leia and Carla happily took the bottom beds, which blocked any way of reaching me or DD. LD and Dude came around into the camper a few more times after that, but didn't say anything else. They eventually all passed out around the campfire. I thought that night would never end, but eventually it did. When we finally got out of the camper and went back to the house, I called my mom to pick me up. It was like nothing had ever happened. I felt crazy the next day. I was surrounded by all these people, and yet no one had noticed anything strange. I questioned myself and the entire experience for years. What if I was really just being paranoid? What if I had interpreted the whole night completely wrong? Leia and I quickly drifted apart after this. I never went back to her house, and I never told anyone about what happened that night. Over 10 years later, during a visit to my parents, my mom was going on about all the gossip she'd heard recently. I was only half listening when suddenly she mentioned, "Hey, that girl Leia from grade school, do you remember her?" Her dad had been in the local paper a few months earlier. He had been arrested and charged with sexual molestation of a minor. Apparently, there had been a couple other claims years prior to his arrest, but nothing ever came of those. I had no interest in knowing anything more about him, though, or in the outcome. I knew in my heart what he and his friends had in mind that night, but I also worried about offending someone or how it would look if I had asked to leave. I also didn't want Leia to be hurt or embarrassed either, so I pretended to be oblivious to her dad's blatantly disgusting behavior. I still hate it when someone tries to put their arm on top of my shoulder. When I was about 3 or 4, my parents went on vacation out of the country. My siblings and I were left with a family my mom knew through a friend. While my siblings were at school during the day, I stayed back. That dad was just like LD, and I was not able to escape him. Things did not end the way they did in the camper. When I was at Leia's, I knew something was wrong because I felt the same way I had back when I was 3. DD's behavior only confirmed my fears. I wish I would have said something comforting to her in the moment or hugged her to help her feel safe, but I didn't. I didn't say much of anything. I did have her sleep next to me on the top bunk, but that's about it. When I was about 9, I had mentioned what happened to my mom while they were on vacation, but she completely shot me down, said there was no way that happened, said I would have tried to fight him off and would never have let anyone touch me. Her response made me believe it had been my fault, and that I let it happen. I also learned that I could not rely on her for support, so the morning she picked me up from Leia's, I knew she wouldn't believe me, or worse, she would have blamed me. I learned later that this was her way of escaping responsibility. If she were forced to acknowledge what had happened, that would mean admitting she made a horrible mistake in her parenting choices. Although this happened back in December 2019, I still think about it on a nearly daily basis because it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I hope it offers some sort of enlightenment on what to do or what not to do if you ever find yourself in a similar situation. Back in early December, I had ventured out to do a bit of late-night shopping. I'm a 31-year-old stay-at-home mother of 2 young children, so once my husband gets home from work, I like to take some time to myself and go shopping, take a drive, or run errands all kid-free. It was around 8:30 p.m. when I arrived at the Target I usually frequent. Now, I'm by no means a paranoid or anxious individual, but I have attended several seminars in college on human trafficking and have done plenty of research on my own, learning to identify red flags and what precautions to take when out in public alone, especially at night. I carry several self-defense items on my person at all times. Caboton, alarm, universal handcuff key, all just in case. I parked directly in front of the store, right next to a cart caddy, and took a mental note of the vehicles parked nearby. Again, just as a precaution. I had that teaching at an early age to always be observant of your surroundings. And I guess being a control freak just kind of naturally makes you that way as well. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary that night though, and the parking lot was actually quite empty, most likely because it was still a weekday. As I entered the store, I began to browse like usual, following the natural flow of the store departments, following the main aisle around. I had been browsing for only 10 to 15 minutes when I noticed a young gentleman in his mid-20s. He was skinny, tall, dressed in a dirty gray 2-piece sweatsuit and brown work boots. He looked over to me. I smiled and said hello, but his facial expression remained weirdly blank. He looked like he may have been high on something just by the look in his eyes, but he didn't seem to care for my gesture and quickly moved on. At first glance, there was nothing in particular that alarmed me about him, except I took notice at the fact that he was just wandering down the main aisle with no cart or basket. hands in his pockets, and didn't seem to be with anyone or looking for anything in particular. I continued shopping with no second thoughts though, and made my way over to the next department. Several minutes had passed by then, and that's when I noticed a second young gentleman wearing the same gray sweatsuit, a similar pair of work boots, and again no card or basket. He too glanced at me, but he quickly darted his eyes away when he realized I was looking directly at him. Now I became a bit more alerted, but still remained composed and continued browsing. Another 15 minutes or so passed, and that's when a third, older man caught my attention. You guessed it. Same gray sweatsuit, same work boots, no cart, no basket, just hands in his pockets. I assumed they were in some sort of work uniform, maybe construction workers or something. But if so, why weren't they walking around together? And why wouldn't they have any items to purchase either? At this point, it was difficult to focus on browsing. I had a bad feeling about these three men, and it became quickly clear that something was a bit off. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I felt as if I was being constantly monitored by the three of them, as if they were all communicating my whereabouts as I continued to make my way through the store. Each department I entered, it didn't take long for me to notice one of the three men pass by whatever aisle I happened to be in, making their presence known to me. I stayed completely vigilant while trying not to panic or allow my suspicions to overwhelm me. Something about their presence felt very heavy and dark, so I decided to test their intentions, prove I wasn't overthinking the situation, and that my bad gut feeling was valid. At this point, I began picking random aisles, traveling back and forth between departments in a very unorganized and random fashion, to see if the men would continue to pass by me as frequently as they had been. Wouldn't you know it, every aisle I popped into, just a few minutes later, one of them would make an appearance, staring me down as they passed by. It felt as if I was being surrounded like a wild animal, hunted even. At this point, they were no longer even trying to be inconspicuous, which was the scariest part of all. Everything instinctual was screaming at me to get out of there. I gripped my cart tightly, and figured if they got too close, I could at least use it to push them away or create some distance between us. By this point, I had been shopping for almost an hour altogether, maybe a bit over, and was ready to purchase the items I needed. But honestly, I felt too uncomfortable to even continue browsing if I wanted to. The men had been following me the entire time, and I was becoming more annoyed if anything. The store was also pretty empty around this time, one of the main reasons I like to go shopping at night, but that made this particular situation even more unsettling. I noticed two preteen girls were wandering around by themselves, which quickly caught my attention because the men had bypassed them as well, making similar advances, only the girls were a bit more oblivious. I quietly got their attention and asked them to go find their parents and stay with them, trying my best not to freak them out. The mother in me was in full-on protection mode. I couldn't even imagine having my young children with me on this night. Thank God they were home safe and sound. As I made my way to the checkout, I noticed one of the men coming up from behind me, walking at a quicker pace this time. I immediately stopped and turned to lock eyes with him as he approached. I will never forget the darkness in his eyes. An eerie smirk formed on his face as he nudged my shoulder, continuing to stare me down, walking backwards to hold his sinister gaze as he exited out the store. I had lost sight of the other two men, and I hated the uncertainty of that. He had made his message very clear in that moment. My stomach dropped and my entire body began to shake. It was a feeling I hadn't felt since I was a kid getting lost in the supermarket. That feeling of desperation. I quickly walked to the checkout and discreetly asked the cashier if I could speak to a manager. I told them what had transpired of the last hour, politely asking for a male employee to walk me to my car and for them to alert their security team member. Well, when I told the manager what had happened, her face immediately sunk as if she had already known about these men. Once I had described them, she confirmed she knew exactly who I was talking about. She expressed that several of the female employees had found the men unsettling in the past, and reassured me that someone would escort me to my car. She made a report about the incident and said she would alert the authorities as well. I was still shaking but felt relieved that she believed me and showed concern for the other young female patrons in the store. She took my information. Then a young male employee walked me out to my car. What I saw as I exited that store made me so sick to my stomach, solidifying all of my suspicions. I noticed that now a white windowless van was parked in the lot directly behind my car, about 3 parking spaces of distance between us. One of the men seated in the driver's seat, and the other 2 leaning against the side of the van facing my car, attempting to hide out of view. I mean, how cliché and obvious can you be? At that point, your license plate might as well read Lady Snatchers. Whatever their intent though, it did not seem pure. I pointed them out to the male employee and yelled out, "There they are!" This prompted the men to scurry into the van and speed out of the parking lot without hesitation. I truly don't know what would have happened if I walked out to my car alone, but I'm freaking grateful I made it home safe and sound and lived to tell my story. Over the following week, I heard there had been several abduction attempts in the shopping center parallel to that target. I'm almost certain it was those same individuals. I grew up in a rural part of northern England, but moved to London 6 years ago to live with my partner, as she had just gotten a job there. I couldn't drive at the time, so I would take the bus to and from work and walk a short way back to our flat. The walk from the bus stop to home never took longer than 10 minutes or so, and it was through a well-lit area as well, lined with shops and various restaurants. Up until this incident, I had never really had any issues on that route. It was November, so it was pretty much dark by the time I left work at 6 p.m. One Friday night, after I had only been living in London a couple of months, one of my work colleagues asked if I wanted to go for a drink with her after work. Now, I'm not a big drinker, but it was a Friday night. My partner was working late anyway, and since I was fairly new in town and desperate to make friends, I agreed to go along for a couple. I took the bus with her straight from work to a pub close to her home. She lived basically the next suburb over from me anyway, so it was fairly close. Not an area I was particularly familiar with, though. I had 2 or 3 drinks, so I was a little bit tipsy, but not drunk. Not that that should matter anyway. I decided to leave at around 10 p.m., so as to not be traveling home too late at night, particularly along a route I did not know. I said my goodbyes and left my colleague and her friends at the pub. On my way out, I stopped to put an empty glass down on the bar. As I did so, I looked down the bar and made brief eye contact with a man sitting a little bit further down. I gave a passing smile, as you might do when you make accidental eye contact with a stranger, then continued on my way out of the pub. The bus stop was maybe 200 yards down and across the street from this pub. You could see it from the entrance. I was about halfway to the stop when I got that prickling feeling on the back of my neck. You know, like how you get when someone's staring at you through a window or perhaps across a busy street. I turned around to look behind me quickly, and it didn't take me long to figure out what was giving me that feeling. It was the man I had glimpsed back at the pub, walking about 20 paces behind me, watching me carefully. I was a little bit weirded out, but I reasoned with myself that it was a Friday night in London, and there were plenty of people on the street. People heading home, people on nights out, people just milling around. I put it down as perfectly innocent, and kept on walking, trying hard not to look back. I reached the stop, and fortunately the bus was only a few minutes away. The man reached the stop only moments later, and proceeded to hover a few feet away from me. I was on my phone and trying not to look at him, but I could just feel his eyes boring into me. I looked up and caught him staring at me, expecting him to look away awkwardly as soon as he realized he had been caught looking. But he didn't. He just kept on staring. This was also the first time I had really gotten a proper look at him. He was a young man, couldn't have been much older than myself actually, and I was in my early 20s at the time. He was quite slender and tall, with short shaved hair. He actually would have been quite good looking, if not for the intensity of his staring. I must have been looking at him for longer than I thought, because he gave me this sly wink, and I quickly looked away. It wasn't the nice kind of wink that might be considered cute or endearing either. It was like those unsmiling, almost threatening kind of winks, the kind that told me he was watching me, that he knew I knew this, and that he did not care one bit. The bus eventually rolled up, and I hopped on, quietly hoping he was not getting on the same bus as me. I wasn't so much afraid at this point as just uneasy. It isn't nice being intensely stared at by anyone, much less a complete stranger. I was still under the assumption at this point, though, that it was just some creepy dude who happened to be at the same bus stop as me. Nothing more than that. I sat down on the lower deck, close behind the driver. My heart sank a little to see the man get on just behind me. Fortunately, there was already someone sat in the seat next to mine, though, so he had to sit across the aisle. Still, he stared at me, now with a strange little smirk on his lips that made me feel even more uncomfortable. I did my best to pretend that I simply hadn't noticed him, only allowing myself an occasional glance up at him to see if he was still watching me. From what I could tell, though, he never looked away once. With each passing minute, I was becoming more and more afraid, despite my best efforts to convince myself that this was all just an innocent misunderstanding on my part. At every stop, I was praying for him to get off, for this to be his stop so I could relax and prove to myself I was just being paranoid. As the stops passed by, I knew I was going to have to get off the bus soon, and I was fairly sure at this point that he was going to follow me. We were coming close to my usual stop when the bus took an unexpected turn onto a housing estate. I was so distracted by this guy staring at me and potentially following me. I had completely forgotten that this was a different bus route to my usual one. In a normal situation, this would not have bothered me, but in my current situation, it was the absolute worst possible thing that could have happened. I was no longer on that well-lit street full of shops in an area I knew so well. Now I was on a dark, quiet, and completely unfamiliar estate. No people around at all, just rows of silent houses with the lights all off. I then realized that I didn't actually know the route home from here either. I knew I had to be close, but having only lived in the area for a couple of months, I hadn't had the chance to come to grips with all the shortcuts yet. I waited until the very last minute to ring the bell for the next stop, and I jumped off very quickly. It was a long shot, but I hoped the weird guy would be caught off guard and not get the chance to follow me. Suffice to say, that plan did not work. In hindsight, I should have just stayed on the bus until it reached the terminal, and then maybe reported my concern to the driver. But at the time, I was a bit tipsy and scared, and I just wanted to go home. It was a dumb, spur-of-the-moment decision, made completely out of panic. He hopped very casually off the bus after me. At this point, there was no doubt in my mind he was following me. I decided to stay at the stop and call someone, anyone to come help me. But all my friends and family that I would usually call in a bad situation lived back home, hundreds of miles away. My partner was working nights and wasn't even allowed to have her phone on her in person. I tried calling the girl who I had been out to the pub with to see if I could maybe double back to hers and stay at her house for the night, but she wasn't answering her phone either. I could call the police, I guess, but what if he realized I had just done that and attacked me before they could get there? All the time I was trying desperately to get in touch with someone who might be able to help me in my current predicament. This guy was casually leaning against the bus stop, hands in pockets, just watching me. Several minutes passed by, and I still had no better plan in mind than to just stay where I was. I certainly didn't want this guy knowing where I lived, after all. These thoughts were all rushing through my mind at about 100 miles per hour, and I damn near crapped myself when suddenly he said, "Hey, what's your name?" I could do nothing but stare at him in surprise for a second or two. Then I forced myself to reply. "Amy," I lied. I figured I didn't want to piss him off at all, so I just answered with whatever name came to my head first. That horrible little smirk slid across his lips again. He was still leaning casually. "Give me your number, Amy," Let's be friends." That didn't sound like a request. There was a sharpness to his voice that made me shudder. "No, thank you," I replied. His face dropped and the smirk disappeared. "Where do you live? I'll walk you there," he said, a little more assertively this time. "I'm okay. I'm staying at a friend's. He's actually coming to get me right now to take me back to his place." I lied again, desperate to come up with anything that would make him go away. He paused for a while, and I could practically hear the cogs turning as he tried to figure out whether or not I was lying. He watched me silently for a long moment, studying my face with this cold calculation. He must have decided that I was lying to him because he suddenly took a step towards me, and through slightly gritted teeth, as if I was really trying his patience, he repeated, "Give me your number, now." Startled at the sudden move toward me, I took several steps back. He continued to approach me. I panicked and turned and tried to walk away from him, but he reached out and grabbed me hard by the wrist. I spun back around to face him. Now the only look on his face was one of complete anger. "There's no need to be such a bitch about this," he hissed. Fear had surged through me when he grabbed my arm. His touch seemed to burn my skin like an open flame. It was repulsive, so much so that my body almost had a convulsive reaction to being touched by him. I managed to twist my arm out of his grip, and I heard a voice in the back of my mind telling me, "You need to get away now. Run." And I did run. I turned and ran as fast as my legs would carry me, back the way the bus had brought me. I didn't even fully know where I was going, but I knew I had to get myself as far away from this person as possible. I made the mistake of looking over my shoulder once to see him now running after me, only a few feet behind. His eyes were wide and furious. The fear and adrenaline kept me going, longer and faster than I'd ever run before. Just as I reached the end of the road, though, I saw exactly what I needed. I instantly burst into tears of relief. Out of nowhere, 2 police officers were now walking towards me along the other side of the street. I made an immediate beeline for them, now also yelling for help. By the time I reached them, I was sobbing, a breathless mess. I could hardly speak to even tell them what had happened. I managed to sputter a few choice words and turned to point towards my pursuer. By now, he was almost back at the other end of the street. He had simply turned around and walked calmly back toward the bus stop, like he was out for an evening stroll. I was worried that the police officers were just going to think I was some crazy random drunk girl, but they could see I was clearly very shaken, and one of them took off running after the man. The man had, by now, disappeared around the corner at the other end of the street, followed shortly after by the police officer. That was the last I saw of him. The officer who went after the guy radioed his partner a few minutes later to say he had lost them once they reached the main street, but he would keep looking. The officer who had stayed with me took a description of the man from me, and I made a report about what had happened. I told the officer I didn't fully know my way home from where I was, so she walked with me back to my front door. I was shaking the entire way. When I got into my room, I lay in bed crying until I fell asleep. I never heard anything else about it after that. There's no doubt in my mind that if he had caught me that night, he would have harmed me. I believe he was out looking for someone to target. I believe he clocked me the moment we made eye contact in the pub. If given the chance, he would have followed me all the way back to my front door in the hope that I would at some point be alone in a secluded enough area for him to grab me. Everything about his demeanor and the way he spoke to me just screamed that this was a man who was just predatory, and the way he was able to go from being furiously angry enough to chase me down the street to immediately regaining his composure and walking away like nothing happened in order to evade being caught is just absolutely terrifying. I'll remember his face for a long time, and I would not be surprised if it comes up on the news at some point in the future. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed the content of this video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you do decide you like my content enough to subscribe, please be sure to hit the bell button right next to the subscribe button and turn notifications to all so you can be notified of every video I post in the future. If you don't feel like doing that though, I post a video nearly every day, so you can just come back every now and then and check up on what you missed. If you guys have any criticisms on what I can do better or any feedback on the stories in the video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as I always enjoy reading all the comments and I try to give them hearts and respond when I can. If you guys would like to reach me for any reason, or you would like to send in a story to be read, you can go ahead and take a look in the description below the video. You'll find a link to all of my social media, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has a theme, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. Last but not least, I also run 2 other channels, Mr. Blue Skies and Darkest Hour, where I do true crime videos and dark documentaries respectively. If that kind of content sounds interesting to you, why not go ahead and check it out and see if it is for you. Aside from that though guys, I think that's pretty much it for now, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.